Meeting of the committee will come to order. Pursuant to notice, I call up the bill H.R. 3887, the William Wilberforce Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act of 2007 for purposes of markup. The chair recognizes himself to explain the bill. As members of the committee heard last week, the scourge of human trafficking remains a large and ever-expanding global problem. It is the world's fastest-growing international organized crime and one of the most profitable, yielding up to $17 billion in profits every single year. Every year, traffickers move between 700,000 and 2 million women and children across international borders for the purpose of serving the sex trade and into forced labor. Last week in the committee, we heard testimony about children in prostitution in Cambodia, and the trafficking survivor spoke to us about her 4-year experience with slavery and abuse right here in Washington, D.C. I was also struck by the consensus that our witnesses expressed about what needs to be done to further combat trafficking, much of which is in the bill we are now considering. The legislation before the committee today continues the committee's past efforts under the leadership of our distinguished colleague, my good friend from New Jersey, Mrs. Smith, to prevent trafficking, protect victims, and prosecute perpetrators. I'm very pleased that we are continuing to work together in a bipartisan way to further amplify U.S. and international efforts to combat human trafficking. H.R. 3887, the Wilberforce Trafficking Victims Reauthorization Act of 2007, provides a wide-ranging set of new initiatives to prevent trafficking abroad, protect victims here in the United States, and prosecute perpetrators around the globe. Some of the key provisions include requiring a comprehensive analysis of trafficking data to help us better understand where victims are actually going and how to free them, providing more help for countries to inspect locations where forced labor occurs, to register vulnerable populations, and to provide more protection to foreign workers, ensuring that U.S. assistance programs are transparent and effective, urging the administration to work with our friends to reach agreements between labor exporters and labor importers so that vulnerable workers have more rather than less protection, creating a zero-tolerance policy for diplomats who abuse their workers, and finally, addressing the issue of child soldiers. I urge all of my colleagues to join me in supporting this very important legislation, and I now yield to my friend from Florida, ranking member, and the key sponsor of this legislation.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. As you had stated, as underscored in the heartbreaking testimony that we heard at last week's hearing, human trafficking is a scourge that continues to rob countless men and women, especially children, of their security, their freedom, and their dignity. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your leadership in introducing this bill, which I am proud to co-sponsor. I commend the diligence and the dedication of your staff. Look forward to your continued cooperation as we move this ambitious bill forward in the legislative process. And I also want to recognize the singular leadership of my good friend from New Jersey, Mr. Chris Smith, the author of the original Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, which this bill reauthorizes and expand. And with that, I'd like to yield my time, Mr. Chairman, to the gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to Ranking Member Ross Layton. This is truly a bipartisan piece of legislation. It is one of those issues where there has been no gap between us on either side of the aisle. It has united conservatives, moderates, and liberals in a grand fight to combat the scourge of modern-day slavery. I think it's particularly appropriate that you've named it after William Wilberforce, the leader in the House of Commons who led the fight against slavery, was lost battle after battle in the House of Commons through all kinds of treachery. Those of you who have read any of the books about his life know that he was a praying man, a fasting man, and never gave up in his fight to end slavery in the UK and all of its colonies and the Caribbean and everywhere else where they had an impact. So it's very appropriate, I think, that you have so designated as such. I would just point out very briefly and would ask that my full statement be made part of the record, Mr. Chairman, but the
Without objection.
TVPA of 2000 and its follow-up authorizations, and this one as well, has really led the effort, not just here in the United States, but globally. The three-pronged strategy is on prevention, prosecution, and the effort to really take this overseas and ensure that other countries enact similar legislation so that there is a seamlessness to this effort. Since the enactment of the TVPA, traffickers here and abroad are increasingly likely to face prosecution and conviction. In the 6-year period before the enactment, the Department of Justice had, in the last 6 years, prosecuted 360 defendants compared to only 89, representing a 300% increase. Worldwide, 6,000 traffickers were prosecuted last year, and more than 3,000 were convicted. We have, I think, made a very, very strong effort to make this a global effort, and again, this legislation takes that one very significant step further. Finally, it also incorporates key provisions of the Child Soldiers Prevention Act of '07, introduced in the House by our friend and colleague Jeff Fortenberry, and I want to thank you for including that and providing a vehicle to move that legislation forward as well. I yield back the balance of my time.
I have a series of perfecting amendments at the desk. The clerk will designate the amendments.
Amendment to H.R. 3887, offered by Mr. Lantos of California. Page 5, line 22, insert solely after responsible. Page 6, line 17, strike, and the mission of the office.
Without objection, the amendments will be considered en bloc and will be considered as read. And the chair is recognized for 5 minutes to explain the amendments. These amendments are, for the most part, minor, clarifying, or technical in nature, and correct several errors that have been found in the text. They include suggestions by several members, including Mr. Fortenberry, and have been cleared by both sides. Does anyone want to be recognized to speak on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All in favor say aye. All opposed say no. The ayes have it. Are there any other amendments? Ms. Woolsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to comment and thank you and Congressman Smith for the leadership on this issue, and to thank Congressman Smith for his steadfast commitment to human rights. It is essential that we reauthorize this bill and accept that anti-trafficking efforts of our government haven't gone quite far enough, need to go much farther. They touch the lives of people every single day, and these aren't faceless people. These are real children, real women, and sexual slavery, slave labor for children just cannot be tolerated. I'd like to suggest, I'm going to vote for it. I think this is a great bill. But between now and the floor, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to work with you and talk about an amendment that would strengthen the protection for victims of trafficking so that they are absolutely ensured that they're safe, so that they will speak out And we'll look, maybe I've missed in this bill what does that as well as I think it should, but I'd like to ask you to work with me on an amendment before we get to the floor.
I'll be very pleased to
Thank
do
you
so.
very much.
Any other colleague
Mr. Chairman.
with an amendment? Yes?
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Sheila Jackson-Lee.
I don't have an amendment at this time. I simply want to briefly thank the chairman and the ranking member and Mr. Smith for the provisions covering child soldiers. And just to recount two countries in particular, Sierra Leone and Liberia, that had to be one of the worst examples of abusing children as child soldiers. And the remnants of that continue to plague those countries, trying to now integrate those child soldiers back into society. It is a violent life, it is a vicious life, and this legislation, by reauthorizing the protection of those children, is vital. Thank you for what it does for labor conditions and the protection of women who are subjected to the violence of human trafficking. And I yield back and ask my colleagues to support the bill. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Burton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just briefly want to say something about the name that this bill has on it, William Wilberforce. I just finished a book called Amazing Grace, and I hope everybody will get the opportunity to read it. This man is not known by an awful lot of people in this country or in the world, but he's probably one of the greatest men who ever lived. And I really mean that. What he did for humanity and to eliminate repressive acts and slave trading is just unbelievable. He spent his whole life doing that, and I just want to say that everybody ought to know who he is, and everybody, if they get an opportunity, ought to read that book. It's called Amazing Grace, and I strongly support this bill.
I thank my friend from Indiana, Mr. Fortenberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do very much appreciate your leadership on this very important legislation to prevent human trafficking, prosecute perpetrators of this most vicious set of crimes, and bring support and healing to victims. I wish to focus my comments as well on one particular aspect of the bill, which addresses the use of child soldiers, one of the most egregious human rights violations of our time. It is estimated that more than 250,000 children are currently exploited as child soldiers, and tens of thousands of girls are subjected to rape and other forms of sexual violence as a result of this heinous practice. In many areas throughout the world, children who, quote, volunteer as child soldiers often do so because they are desperate to survive in combat-ravaged regions where their families and every semblance of community support have been devastated. Mr. Chairman, children belong on playgrounds and not battlegrounds, and as you have kindly mentioned, I have submitted legislation along with Mr. Payne of New Jersey, which did build on previous efforts of Mr. Smith of New Jersey as well, urging the U.S. government to take action against foreign governments and paramilitaries that coerce children into combat. And I'm very grateful and pleased that this language has been included in your human trafficking bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fortenberry. It's a sheer joy to work on a bipartisan piece of legislation. We always do our best job when we work together. The chairman is prepared to receive a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the favorable recommendation of H.R. 3887 as amended to the House.
The question occurs on the motion by the gentleman from California to report H.R. 3887 as amended favorably to the House. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the motion is adopted. Without objection, the bill will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute, incorporating the amendments adopted by the committee, and the staff is directed to make any technical and conforming amendments. Pursuant to notice, I call up the bill H.R. 275, the Global Online Freedom Act, for purposes of markup, and move its favorable recommendation to the House. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute before the members will be considered as the base text for purposes of amendment, will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I yield to the sponsor of the bill, Ms. Smith to explain his legislation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And this legislation, again, a bipartisan piece of legislation, which I know you strongly back and have worked in shaping the text, has a strong support from virtually every one of the major human rights organizations, from Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and Reporters Without Borders, to name just a few. The legislation was several years in the making. Matter of fact, we had a very significant hearing last year, as you recall. It was probably the longest hearing I've ever chaired. It went almost 8 hours. We heard from Cisco, Microsoft, Google, and a number of other very interested parties, raising the issue about how the Internet, while it has great promise and great hope — I do Google searches all the time, I'm sure other members of this committee do in like manner — but it is increasingly being used as a tool of repression in what we designate in the bill as Internet restricting countries. We know for a fact, it's beyond any reasonable doubt, that countries like China and Vietnam, Ethiopia, and some of the other countries where the Internet has now become a tool used and employed by the secret police to find, incarcerate, and then ultimately torture and give long prison sentences to men and women who are speaking out on behalf of freedom and democracy. I would point out that the office that is created in this legislation mirrors what we did with trafficking in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, when we established an office that would be the hub, the nerve center, the command and control center at the Department of State to work the issue of trafficking. We do likewise now in the area of Internet restrictions and Internet violations of freedom. We also did the same thing in the IRFA bill, the International Religious Freedom Act. And that office, which was initially opposed by the State Department, has worked wonders in trying to promote religious freedom all around the globe. I would also point out to my colleagues that the Heritage Foundation, back in 2004, made a number of recommendations, including the establishment of an Office of Global Internet Freedom, which is precisely what we do in this legislation. So both on the conservative and on the liberal side, again, we have this joining of interest and concern on behalf of those who are suffering the fate of dictatorships around the world. One of the things I pointed out in our hearing, and I repeat it again today to my colleagues, history shows us that American companies and their subsidiaries have at times provided the technology to crush human rights in the past. I encourage every member of this body to read Edwin Blake's book, IBM and the Holocaust. And it reveals the dark story of IBM's strategic alliance with Nazi Germany, and that includes IBM US as well as IBM Germany. He asked the question and then answered it in the book. Did you ever wonder why the Gestapo always had such long lists of people, where they lived, who they were? We're talking about mostly Jews now. And it was because they were the demographers of their time. And then they collaborated. They were good soldiers, if you will, with the Gestapo, and tracked down and hunted down virtually every one of the Jews except those that were shielded and jettisoned off to safety in the West. I say that because, wittingly or unwittingly, many of those companies now that are operating in places like China, who originally thought that this would be a boom to freedom and to openness, have discovered and still have not fully appreciated that they are now part of a regime. Dictatorships, as we all know, need two major things to operate and to flourish and to prosper. They need propaganda, and now the Internet has become the means by which, through filtering and the like, certain words. The Dalai Lama, last week, we congratulated him on and gave him the Congressional Gold Medal, as we ought to do. He's a great leader on behalf of human rights and the Buddhist and the Tibetan people. Yet, if you go in and do a Google search in the PRC and put in the Dalai Lama, you will get nothing but tirades against the man. You will also probably get a knock on your door from the cyber police, 35,000 strong in China, which continually monitors the Internet, courtesy of U.S. technology and Western technology. So propaganda and secret police, the two pillars upon which dictatorship rests, are now being exponentially advanced by the Internet. Our legislation, by creating an office, now begins to try to take back, and we're talking about two basic areas: peaceful political or religious content. They're the two, the definition of what we're looking at to protect is peaceful political or religious content. So that's the kind of thing that's being filtered in these dictatorships, and that's the kind of thing that we're trying to address. Reporters Without Borders made a very, very cogent statement, and I urge members to go to their website and read what is really happening. They point out that in China, where there are at least 52 people that we know of in prison for expressing themselves online, self-censorship now is in full force. They point out that just 5 years ago, many people thought Chinese society and politics would be revolutionized by the internet, a supposedly uncontrollable medium. Now, with China enjoying geopolitical influence, people are wondering the opposite, whether perhaps China's internet model, based on censorship and surveillance, may one day be imposed on the rest of the world. This legislation seeks to protect personally identifying information. Shirtao and many other people who have gotten long prison sentences in China did so when they simply sent an email. In his case, he sent information about what the propaganda office in China had sent out about a closed memo about the Tiananmen Square massacre. And they said, you can't say this, you can't say that. So he sent it out. For that, he got 10 years in prison. 10 years. Yahoo collaborated and provided that information. That personally identifying information needs to be removed from these dictatorships, put outside the country, outside the reach of these dictatorships, so that we do not have more Shirtaos finding themselves in prison. I met in Hanoi with a woman who is the wife of Dr. Fong Song. What did he do? Dr. Song took off U.S. Embassy Hanoi a wonderfully written, very short piece, an essay, called What is Democracy? He translated it into Vietnamese. He was tracked down because he posted it on the internet and got 5 years in prison. Reporters Without Borders reports that in May alone of 2007, some 6 cyber journalists, individuals got prison sentences, were arrested as part of this ever-growing crackdown of using the internet to find and incarcerate the democracy activists. We also, in the legislation, finally, Mr. Chairman, provide a penalty for those who collaborate in the jamming of Radio Free Asia, of Voice of America, and U.S. surrogate broadcasting. It seems unconscionable to me that a U.S. company would want to in any way participate in stifling that message. We know, during the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union days, that those broadcasts into those areas, as well as the BBC, help keep hope alive. Now we have internet companies who are collaborating with the secret police in order to make a buck, to jam those sites and to put them off limits. So during our hearing, and I've done this many times since, I went to the internet search engine for China and typed in Tiananmen Square. If you do a Google search for Tiananmen Square, you get millions of hits. You see people in the streets. You get descriptions of the bayoneting and the killing that went on. If you go with the Google search inside of China and use their search engine, you get wonderful pictures of people posing for photographs on Tiananmen Square. So it is a Potemkin village. And believe me, if you do that enough, if you control the propaganda and the message enough, democracy has no hope. No hope whatsoever in these dictatorships. So
will the gentleman yield? Will the gentleman yield?
I'll be happy to yield.
Is the gentleman aware that some of the U.S. companies, or at least one, that sold some of the same equipment that would allow broadcasting into broadcasting on behalf of Radio Free Asia, have now basically sold the equivalent of the Gestapo the technology which would allow them to silence or to jam those very broadcasts? The irony here that U.S. taxpayers would pay for the ability to broadcast a surrogate free radio and then have a U.S. firm sell the technology which they developed to jam that very asset that they helped develop is truly one of the most despicable ironies that I am aware of, and I just wanted to commend the gentleman for the legislation. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman, I'll just conclude on this. Cisco sold PoliceNet to the Chinese secret police. PoliceNet has now enabled the Chinese apparatus, has connected one police station after another. It has given them the ability to monitor everything that's going across the worldwide net, obviously, in the PRC, to find these individuals who speak out, like the Dalai Lama, like Rabia Kadir, who is now thankfully in the United States, and so many other brave dissidents. I asked the question, and I ask it again today. Had we been living as you survived the Holocaust, Mr. Chairman, would we want to collaborate with the finding of someone like Anne Frank and say, oh, she's over here in apartment 5B? That's what these companies are doing. And I say maybe unwittingly. Maybe they, you know, I like the way the Heritage Foundation puts it, China's Orwellian internet. That's what we've allowed. We can make a difference. We may not be able to stop it completely, but I think we can mitigate the ability of the Chinese government to continue the technology progress they're making, and other dictatorships like Belarus, which also uses the internet to destroy the dissidents and to disrupt religious freedom.
I want to thank my friend for his powerful statement. Are there any amendments? Ms. Smith.
I don't have an amendment, Mr. Chairman. I just want to comment on the bill, if I may. I think, first of all, the Office of Global Security Freedom makes an enormous amount of sense. It is something that we should be working on much more aggressively than we are to figure out how to deal with many of the challenges that Mr. Smith raises in terms of how do you, allow the internet to go forward and, be the bastion of openness that it is and still combat many of the issues that were raised here. I think that makes a great deal of sense. I also think that the suppression that Mr. Smith mentions that's going on in China is as bad as he describes it. However, we have to look at exactly what would happen under this bill. None of what Mr. Smith just described would change. China would not all of a sudden be unable to do any of the things that he just mentioned. They just wouldn't be doing it with any U.S. products. So let's be clear on that, first of all. We here in this committee or in this Congress are not in a position to stop the behavior that is being described. All we would be doing is we would be preventing U.S. companies from doing any business in China, because regrettably, we're not the only people in the world who know how to make this stuff work. I think that's a fact that some in this Congress seem to forget. China, for instance, has a number of software companies, a number of internet companies. They are developing that technology. And our colleagues and friends in Europe also have companies along those lines, and they are placing no such restrictions on them. Now, I think what would make a certain amount of sense is you hear some of the specific technology, and what I'm very sympathetic to is to come up with ways to prohibit the selling of technology that has no other purpose than the suppression. And I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the example that Mr. Smith mentioned at the end there, that specific technology that was designed to help the secret police in China for no other purpose, a specifically designed piece of software. That would make a great deal of sense. But the bill as we have it now is overly broad. Basically, it says that our companies can't do any business with these countries as far as providing personally identifiable information except for legitimate foreign law enforcement purposes. And what does that mean? I'll get a little local here to draw an example. We have, ironically, another issue that's working its way through Congress right now, and that is whether or not telecom companies in this country should be exempt from reliability for providing that exact same type of information to our government under the warrantless wiretap program that was instituted by the President. So we're trying to exempt them from liability, for a warrantless search situation, same thing. And I don't.
Will the gentleman yield?
Not right.
I would like to ask my colleagues to, if I may.
Sure, go ahead.
I would like to ask my colleagues to suspend this colloquy. I want to hear everybody, but I think it's important we proceed with a vote because we now have a reporting quorum. It is my hope that all of my colleagues will return after we cast our vote. This is an important discussion. I think Mr. Smith is entitled to explain his position in toto. But I want to be certain that the vote takes place on this legislation, and then I will open up the opportunity for any additional comments. Is that satisfactory? I thank my colleagues.
I guess I'm unclear. Am I allowed to finish before we go, or?
I would like to
Okay.
ask you to withhold until we can have a dialogue following the vote on the floor.
No. We've got to vote on. Well, I guess that's okay, but on the other hand, it's a little hard to make an argument when you're 2 minutes into it and all of a sudden it's cut off and everyone goes away for 15 minutes and you come back. It sort of undermines the effectiveness just a little bit.
Well, I don't wish to undermine my friend's dialogue. I do wish to state that we now have, I believe, 7 minutes left for the vote, so the committee will stand in recess.
So it's one vote, one back.
What's the motion?
Yeah, I'm going to revise this text since it got all screwed up. Don?
So we're gonna.
I think that was. Yes. I was trying to get him to finish this one. And right, that's the problem. But I tried to, I was going to. Thank you. I was going to try to finish. I was trying to get him to finish this.